Hello, welcome to another Maine Historical Society virtual program. I'm Kathleen Newman. It is July 7th, 2021, and this is our book talk with Michael Trapani on Panic in the Senate, the fight over the Second Bank of the United States, and the American Presidency. Michael Trapani has taught United States history in central New Jersey for 15 years. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in education from Fairleigh Dickinson University, as well as a master's degree in history from Arizona State University. His book, Panic in the Senate, The Fight Over the Second Bank of the United States and the American Presidency, was published this year by Algora Publishing. And when he's not teaching, writing, or reading history, Mike enjoys coaching high school baseball, playing golf, and spending time with his family in Rockaway, New Jersey. Thank you, Mike, so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. It's a very nice introduction, and thank you to the Maine Historical Society for having me on tonight, and to those of you who are tuning in to hear me talk about my book, as Kathleen said, Panic in the Senate. The main theme of this book really is the transformation of the presidency. The presidency has undergone a lot of changes since the days of Washington to the modern day, but I argue that it was during Andrew Jackson's administration that the first real changing of the direction of the office occurred. And those changes came as a result of Jackson's war with the Second Bank of the United States, what becomes known as the Bank War. Now, the book is called Panic in the Senate, so where does the Senate fit into all this? Well, the Senate, I also argue, is kind of the final battleground for this struggle over which direction the presidency would take. And it was in the Senate where the Jackson opponents were strongest, where you had names like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, all in the Senate at that time, struggling to stop this transformation of the presidency from occurring, to stop Jackson from becoming what they called him as a modern day Caesar, and instead restoring the power of the president of the government to the halls of Congress, where they believed it should be, and where they believed the founders thought it should be. Now, this book really just gets into the debates that took place over the future of the presidency as they unfolded in the Senate. For our main audience today, since this is a Maine Historical Society presentation, I'm going to be focusing also on the contributions of the two senators from the state of Maine, Shepley and Peleg Sprague, who both contributed very important contributions to the debate as they unfolded. So before we can get to any of that, though, we have to figure out first, what was the Second Bank of the United States, and why did Andrew Jackson hate it so much? So at this point, I'm going to share my screen with you and have a little presentation on the screen and go over all this, and we'll get into the nitty gritty here. So let me give me 1 sec. Share my screen. Okay, so I'm hoping you can all see that. I'm sure you can. All right, so as I said, that the first bank of the Second Bank of the United States, was established in 1816. So this is 5 years after its predecessor, the First Bank of the United States, was allowed to expire. And the Second Bank was given a 20-year charter. So what you're seeing here is the bank, the main branch, which was on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. The bank also had branches all over the country. The War of 1812 made it very clear to the people of the country and the politicians of the country that there was a need for a national bank, an institution to regulate currency, to regulate the behavior of the multitude of state banks that were in existence that were lending very freely. They called it wildcat lending. And just to manage the government's finances, to collect taxes, to disperse money for government expenditures. A national bank would serve all of those functions. And in 1816, after the war kind of destroyed the economy, there was a movement to recharter a new bank. Now, the bank did have detractors, though. It didn't continue in 1811 for a reason. People voted against it, and it remained unpopular among some, mainly because people felt it was unconstitutional. That was kind of the old argument against the bank. But there was also the possibility of the bank becoming too powerful, just accumulating too much wealth and having too much influence over the country, and that it would bestow unfair privileges on a select few. The bank would be a public-private hybrid. So some of the bank's money would be government money and the remaining money would be private investors. So the idea was, or the thought was, that wealthy financiers, wealthy bankers centered in the Northeast and overseas are going to invest in the bank, reap profits from the bank at the expense of the common everyday citizen. So it certainly did not have, it was not without detractors, that's for sure. Now, it didn't help the bank's cause that within 3 years of its chartering in 1819, the country plunged into its first economic depression during peacetime. And it was called the Panic of 1819. Now, the bank was not the cause of the panic. It had a multitude of causes, but the bank's presence certainly did not help and contributed to the outbreak of the panic. The bank's role in the Panic of 1819 centers largely around land. If you see here on this map, Western land is what we're talking about, and back then, Western land was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, today's Midwest. So during the War of 1812, trade kind of shut down, especially with Europe and specifically with England. And even before the war, trade was very slow with those European countries due to the embargo and different things that had gone on. Then when the war ends, trade picks up again, and there is a large demand for American crops, which leads to a land grab. Farmers, speculators want to go out west and gobble up as much land as they can so they can cultivate it, meet the demand for the American crops, and make money off of it. And the Bank of the United States becomes one of the main creditors for this land grab. They start lending money out to people, individuals, as well as to Western state and local banks. And they're lending very wildly and very lavishly, kind of the opposite of what they were trying, what the bank was created to do. They were supposed to be stopping this type of practice. Instead, they were engaging in it. And what this does is it creates a bubble. These banks are lending to other banks. These banks are then lending to people. They have heavily mortgaged farms. And as long as harvests are good, as long as demand remains high, everything's great. But as soon as something goes wrong, a bad harvest, demand dries up a little bit, the bubble bursts, and a panic ensues. And that's exactly what happened. The bank began calling in loans from individuals and from local banks. Local banks, in turn, had to call in their own loans. Many farmers couldn't meet their obligations, and they faced foreclosure. The bank shouldered a lot of the blame for this. So the bank gets off to a pretty rocky start in its early years. Now, as our boom and bust economic cycle tends to do, it booms at some point. Eventually, the panic is over. A few years into after the panic ensues, the panic is done, and the bank starts to recover its image with the recovering economy, thanks in large part to the man pictured here, Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle becomes the bank president in 1823. He's a banking genius. He's someone who was very in front of his time in terms of how banking worked. And under Biddle's leadership, the bank starts to perform the functions it was created to perform, most notably creating a uniform currency, a currency that was acceptable all over the country. At this point in time, banks, the hundreds of banks existed in the country, and they all issued their own notes. And these notes were not redeemable in various parts of the country. So there was not a stable currency. Biddle, under his leadership, was able to establish a uniform currency for the bank that was acceptable by the government for taxes and redeemable in places around the country. And the bank becomes very popular and, in some people's view, indispensable to the country's existence. Despite that, though, the bank still had its detractors. And among those detractors was Andrew Jackson. Now, why did Andrew Jackson not like the bank? Well, Andrew Jackson lost money in the Panic of 1819, like many people, so he blamed the bank, like many people did as well. He also had some paper money schemes go wrong, and that led him to starting to distrust paper money in general and the banks that issued it. And the Bank of the United States, of course, was up on his list. But what really got to him, what really was kind of the last straw for him, was that he was led to believe that the bank conspired against him in the election of 1828 against John Quincy Adams, pictured on the right. And although Jackson won that election fairly easily, he was, like, as I said, led to believe, based on some very shaky evidence, that the bank was against him. So Jackson, if you know anything about him, was not someone that you cross. He was not one to shy away from a fight. So the bank kind of becomes gets to the top of his list of enemies. He makes it pretty clear in his first address to Congress that he's unhappy with the bank. He says he's unhappy with it, in his words, as presently constructed, and goes into how the bank was not performing its functions adequately, which was patently wrong. It was doing quite well, but Jackson said what he had to say. So Nicholas Biddle, the bank president, he's concerned that his bank might be in a little bit of trouble. It's 1829. The bank's charter expires in 1836. So he has under 7 years before the bank is up for renewal. And he wants to ensure that his bank gets another 20-year charter. And the best way of doing this, he thinks, is to kind of ingratiate himself to Jackson and to the administration in hopes of getting on his good side and hopefully getting the bank another 20 years. By 1832, though, it's pretty clear that this is not going to happen. Jackson has not really said anything to make Biddle think that the bank is safe. In fact, he said certain things here and there to indicate that quite the opposite. He's talked about how he wants, if there's going to be another bank, that he wants to have a hand in creating it. So, Biddle and other bank supporters are a little concerned by this point, and they decide to take a pretty drastic step, and that is to make the election of 1832, which was upcoming, a referendum on the bank. If they could make the election bank versus no bank, then perhaps the popularity of the bank could be enough to defeat Andrew Jackson. So Henry Clay, pictured here, who is the National Republican candidate who's going to run against Jackson during this 1832 election, he and others were able to kind of get on board and get Biddle on board with the idea of applying early for recharter. So instead of waiting until 1836 to recharter the bank, instead, let's apply for recharter in 1832, 4 years early. And the idea was, because there was enough pro-bank sentiment in Congress, the bill would pass and it would land on Jackson's desk, and this would paint Jackson into a corner. He would either have to sign the bill and then give 20 years life to a bank that he hated, or, and this is what they expected he would do, veto the bill and then establish himself as the anti-bank candidate. And now the election becomes Henry Clay and the bank, or Andrew Jackson and no bank. And again, the idea was maybe the bank will be enough to defeat Jackson. Now, this was a pretty misguided idea. I don't think a lot of people really thought that the bank would actually sink Jackson, but it was Hail Mary time at this point. Jackson was wildly popular, and there wasn't a whole lot of hope for Clay to defeat him, so they kind of took a shot here, and they hoped for the best. As expected, Jackson vetoed the vetoed the bill. On July 10th. It becomes one of the most consequential vetoes in presidential history. I'll explain why a little bit later. But for now, we'll just kind of move on. And the election is set up the way that Clay and the bank supporters hoped. Unfortunately for them, it has no bearing on the outcome. As you can see on the map here, Jackson wins easily. It's not even close, 219 to Clay's 49, some scattered votes for other candidates elsewhere. And the bank really had no bearing on Jackson's reelection. But what it did do was it just got him more angry. Jackson, again, vindictive, not someone that you're going to want to cross. And instead of letting the bank just live out its remaining years peacefully until the charter expires, Jackson makes it his mission now to destroy the bank then and now. And that's kind of where this bank war term comes from. So how is Jackson going to do this? This picture here is Jackson often referred to the bank as a many-headed monster. So how is he going to slay this monster? Well, he decides the best way to do that is to strip it of its resources and to strip it of its status. Remember, the bank is a hybrid public-private corporation. So it has public and private money. At this time in 1833, about 25 to 30% of the bank's capital was government funds, to the tune of about $8 to $10 million. So Jackson's idea was, well, if we remove that $8 to $10 million from the bank, if we give the bank that 30% hit, it won't be able to function properly. Additionally, if we remove the government deposits from the bank, it no longer is a government bank. It's just a regular commercial bank. It won't have that status as a government bank, and it'll just be a weak commercial bank. So this is what Jackson, conspires to do. Now, despite having illusions of grandeur of his own power, he knew that he could not just unilaterally say, we're going to take the deposits out of the bank. The bank's charter specifically said that only the Secretary of the Treasury can issue such an order. And the Secretary of Treasury at the time, the man you see here, his name is Lewis McLean, he was a bank supporter, so he is not someone who could be counted on to issue the removal order that Jackson wanted. So he kicks him to the Secretary of State position and replaces him with the man you see here, William Duane of Pennsylvania. Now, William Duane was he had very strong anti-bank credentials. His father was an old school Jeffersonian Republican who had very strong feelings against the bank. So he had the pedigree of being someone who was against the bank, and Jackson felt he was the right man to issue the order. But much to Jackson's surprise and much to his annoyance, Duane was no more willing to issue the order than was McLean. Saying that in light of the bank's imminent demise in 1836, issuing this order now would be, in his words, arbitrary and needless. So he refuses the order. Now, this is in June when he's appointed. So Jackson spends the summer trying to work on Duane to change his mind. This all kind of culminates on September 18th when Jackson gathers his cabinet together and he issues a paper that outlines his reasons for wanting the deposits removed from the bank, the government's money removed from the bank, and he takes full responsibility for this action. He likely said this to assuage Duane, to kind of calm his nerves a little bit about anything that might go wrong as a result of the removal, but Duane is still unmoved and will not issue the order. So Jackson fires him, removes him from office, and puts in his place Roger B. Taney, his attorney general. Taney will go on to later infamy in the Dred Scott decision, but at this point in time, he is the attorney general, and he becomes secretary of the Treasury. He himself is a rabid anti-bank man, perhaps even more so than Jackson himself, and he has no trouble issuing the order. Just 3 days into taking office, he issues the order. Now, the order itself is slightly different than what they planned. They did not actually remove the deposits from the bank in one fell swoop. Instead, they issued an order saying that as of October 1st, the government will no longer deposit its money in the Bank of the United States branches. Instead, they're going to deposit the money in various state banks that become known as pet banks because of the political considerations that went into choosing them. So instead, the $8 to $10 million that are in the bank at the time, once that money is drained out through regular expenditures, the spigot would be turned off, so to speak. So no more money would be coming in. So that is basically what they order. So Nicholas Biddle, the bank president, he knows this is coming. The writing is on the wall. He understands this. So he takes steps to try and mitigate the damage. And what he essentially does is he creates a panic. The book is called Panic in the Senate. The panic part comes from the fact that Biddle creates a financial panic by manipulating the money supply. He contracts credit and he calls in loans to try and take money out of circulation. There's several reasons for why he did this. The first, of course, is to offset the amount of money he'd be losing by not having the government deposit its funds there anymore. But his other reason was to try and create such financial distress around the country that they would look to the bank to save it, and that they would blame Jackson and his move of removing the deposits for their troubles. So he's hoping to create enough of a panic, and people don't quite understand how finances work and economics of a country works, that perhaps they'll blame Jackson for all of this. So that's what he does there. So this is what the Senate, when they convene in December of 1833, the 23rd Congress, the Senate convenes there. This is what they're facing when they take their seats in Washington. They're dealing with this panic that's setting in, and Jackson's bold move to remove the deposits and basically fundamentally alter the direction of the economy. And among the senators who sat down in Washington, D.C. in December were your Maine senators. So this is at the point where I'm going to take a minute to just introduce the two Maine senators who participated in these debates. Maine was very unique in that it sent senators from opposing sides. Most states, I'm assuming you know that each state has two senators. Most states sent two senators from the same side, either from two Jacksonians or two we'll call them Whigs from this point on, although they didn't call themselves Whigs until a little bit later, but we'll just call them Whigs. Those were the anti-Jacksonians. Most states sent two of each, or two of each of one side. Maine sent one of each. Shepley was a Jacksonian, and Peleg Sprague was a Whig. Now, Peleg Sprague, I'm sorry, after Shepley, we'll start with him. He was born in Groton, Massachusetts, and he ended up going to Dartmouth. And he found himself in Saco in 1814, and he joined a law practice there. And here's Saco then and today. I think it's actually very similar vantage points, what you're looking at there. But Shepley was an advocate for Maine statehood. He was a gifted lawyer, gifted attorney, and he was elected. He served on the Maine State Supreme Court, and then he was elected to the Senate in 1833. So for Shepley, it was his maiden voyage in the Senate. When he arrived in December, it was day one for him as a senator. Now he entered the Senate with very, very high hopes. And a high bar set for him. A newspaper commented, to quote the newspaper, if his abilities, Shepley, if his abilities as a senator are equal to his as a lawyer, he will surpass even Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton is or was the #1 Jacksonian supporter in the Senate. He was a very gifted senator. So to compare, to say that he could be perhaps even better than Benton, that was a very, very high bar for Shepley to leap over. So he enters the Senate with this this strong sense of possibilities for him. Sprague came from the Whig side. This is Peleg Sprague. His family came to America during the Great Migration in 1629. So his roots go way back to the Puritans coming over here in the early days of America, or of European settlement at least. And his family settled in Kennebec County, and he also, like Shepley, entered into law. Now, Sprague had a very unique courtroom style. He was very showy. He was very forceful. He spoke with a lot of gesticulations and hand gestures and whatnot, which was kind of contrary to the more solemn, studious delivery of most attorneys at this time. And because of this, they felt he'd be very well suited for politics. He also, like Shepley, was an advocate for Maine statehood during the 18 teens when that was going on. He was elected to Congress in 1825 and then to the Senate in 1829. So unlike Shepley, Sprague was a veteran of the Senate in 1833. And he was actually pretty well known for a speech he gave in 1830 against Indian removal. So he went, he locked horns with Andrew Jackson earlier over Indian removal, and he was known for that. So Shepley kind of came in as an unknown entity. Sprague was a known entity when the Senate session began. So the session began. It becomes known as the panic session because during the session, this economic panic is happening. So the Charter of the Bank of the United States requires the Secretary of the Treasury to report to Congress the reasons for removing the deposits if he decides to do that. So by law, Taney had to issue a report to the Senate, which came just days into the session. And the report is pretty much a recapitulation of Jackson's paper that he presented to the Senate. And this paper sets off this debate in the Senate that lasted for pretty much 3 months nonstop. It's the longest continuous Senate debate in the history of the Senate to that point in time. As I said, it goes on for about 3 months. And the focal point of this debate is Henry Clay's resolutions. So Henry Clay, on December 26th, he gets up and he issues a speech. It goes on for about 3 days. And in the beginning of the speech, he presents these resolutions. And the first of the resolutions is censuring Jackson for taking an unconstitutional hold over the public treasury and usurping congressional authority in doing so. The second resolution basically says that Taney's reasons for removing the deposits are unsatisfactory and insufficient. The book covers both of the debates over both of these resolutions, but for our purposes tonight, since we're talking about presidential power, we're just going to look at the first resolution, the one that specifically targets Jackson. And so these resolutions, and this is a written version of the first resolution here. You can kind of see it a little bit on the screen there. These resolutions kick off debates over the Constitution that haven't been discussed since the founding of the country. Very, very key constitutional matters: separation of power, removal of executive officers, the nature of the Treasury. Is it executive? Is it legislative? Who does the Secretary of the Treasury answer to? The President or to Congress? All these different debates, and more generally speaking, just how the government should work, and what is the President's relationship to Congress and to the people. They speak about this for, like I said, about a good 3 months. So how we're going to, well, actually, before I get any further, I want to talk about this first. One of the first things that they get into, and I bring this up because it actually correlates a lot to what we saw just recently in the last couple of years. If you remember when President Trump was impeached the first time around, the Republicans didn't spend a whole lot of time defending what he did. Instead, they kind of attacked the process that brought the debate before them, and the Jacksonians did the same during this debate. So this is actually not from that exact time, but this is the Senate at that time. That's Henry Clay speaking. And it was really Thomas Hart Benton, pictured here, who started this off. He called the whole proceeding, this debate over these resolutions, a violation of the Senate's authority. Basically, what he argued is that the resolutions that Clay, well, the first resolution that Clay brought forward was impeachable. It was an impeachable offense. It was, you're accusing the president of usurping congressional authority, of violating the Constitution, of taking an unconstitutional hold over the Treasury, essentially stealing money. That is an impeachable matter, and it is not the Senate's job to debate that unless it is during an impeachment trial, which it is not. The House of Representatives is responsible for that. And instead, we're going to debate this here and presumably vote on this at some point and pretty much give our decision before the trial even happens. He says, his exact quote, "It is a proceeding in which the first magistrate of the Republic is to be tried without being heard, and in which his accusers are to act as judges." So it's the Senate, Clay, who's accusing him of these crimes, and now they're going to vote on it and pretty much, be accusers and judges. He's saying that that's wrong. So Clay, of course, responds to this sarcastically. He says, "Shall we sit silently by and see ourselves stripped of one of the most essential of our legislative powers, which is the power of debate, because against all human probability, he, Jackson, may hereafter be impeached." So he's basically saying, are you kidding me? You really think that Jackson's going to be impeached, that the House of Representatives, which was pro-Jackson, there was a pro-Jackson majority in the House, that they're really going to impeach him? So we're just going to sit here and not say a word about this? Like, you're crazy is pretty much what he's saying here. So it was kind of interesting. When I was researching this and I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, that's very similar to what happened with the whole Trump thing. So how I'm going to present the debate to you is through the words of your Maine senators, Shepley and Sprague. So how the debate went down is over the 3-month period, between 10 and 12 senators spoke at various points. And like I said, they spoke for 2, 3, sometimes even 4 days. Their speeches would go on for. And there might be a day or two separating one speech from another, and maybe one guy would respond to the words of a senator from a few weeks prior. So putting it all together was kind of tricky. The book kind of reads like they're actually having a real-time discussion. This one said this one said that, when in actuality, this one said this, and then maybe 2 weeks later, this one said that. So for our purposes, I'm going to present some of the main arguments through the words of Shepley and Sprague, because they both participated heavily in the debate. And one of the first issues that came up was, what is the nature of the Treasury? Is the Treasury responsible to the executive, the president, or to Congress? And it seems like a simple answer. The Treasury is an executive department, so it should be, it's a cabinet department. It should be responsible to the executive. But Clay and the Whigs tried to argue otherwise. And in his initial speech, Henry Clay brought up a very interesting matter of how the departments were named. The first 3 cabinet departments were the State Department, the War Department, and the Treasury Department, and they were created in that order. And the State Department, when it was created, the bill was titled "A Bill to Create an Executive Department Called the State Department." The War Department, same thing, a bill to create an executive department called the War Department. When the Treasury Department was created, it was simply titled "A Bill to Create a Treasury Department." No executive within that. And Clay jumped on that and said, well, that was purposeful, that the Department of the Treasury was specifically not titled an executive department because it was never meant to be an executive department. It was supposed to be subservient to Congress. After Shepley is one of the first people to speak after Clay's speech. I believe he's the 3rd person to speak after Clay. And he jumps on this and basically says, it is said the Treasury is organized upon a different principle from the rest of the departments. In what consists the difference? A difference of name is to alter the power given by the Constitution to the executive. So basically he's saying, are we really going to ignore the last 40 years of how the Treasury has operated? All right. It's essentially been an executive department for the last 40 years. We're going to ignore that because when they named the department, They didn't call it an executive department at that time. And he brings up the fact that the following day, when they talked about the salaries of the cabinet officials, the heads of the departments, the Treasury Secretary was lumped in with the War Secretary, with the State Secretary, and with the Secretary of the Navy. So he's saying in other cases, the Treasury is clearly an executive department. So let's not go there. Now, the other Whigs, they didn't quite jump on board with Clay in saying that the Treasury was not an executive department, but they did argue that the Treasury, while maybe an executive department in some aspects, was certainly subservient to Congress in many other respects. And this is where Sprague jumps in. Essentially, he argues that he kind of gives a would you rather have this or would you rather have that scenario. Shall it, the Treasury, be under the control of Congress, limited, restrained, and surrounded by fixed laws? Or shall it be left to the sole, unguided, ungoverned, undefined will of one man? So basically he's saying, what sounds better? Should we have a Treasury Department that is controlled by Congress, that has set laws and is restrained by Congress? Or are we going to let the Treasury just be in the hands of one very dangerous man, in his view, and that's Andrew Jackson? So he's kind of giving you that either or. He also then rattles off a bunch of responsibilities the Secretary of the Treasury has to Congress to try and prove that the Secretary is in fact answerable to Congress, responsible to Congress. And one of the things he talks about is that the Secretary has to report to Congress often on the state of the finances. And a lot of the Whigs echo that. Now, Shepley responds to that and basically says, are all persons agents to Congress merely because they report to Congress? The Secretary was not required to report because he was an agent of Congress, but to enable Congress to know the state of the finances. So he's essentially arguing, well, yeah, of course the Treasury Secretary reports to Congress, not because he's an agent of Congress, it's because he has to let Congress know what's going on with the money. Congress has to make laws. Congress has to draft bills in regards to taxes and whatnot based on the finances. How are they going to know what the state of the finances are? Well, from the Treasury Secretary. So he's got to talk to them. And then he goes on to talk about how, well, the president answers to Congress. The president has to report to Congress as well. Is the president under the thumb of Congress? Of course not. The president is the head of the executive branch. So he's saying that merely reporting to Congress cannot just automatically make a person answerable to Congress in that way. So they go back and forth, not just Shepley and Sprague, of course, but all of them on these various points. Another very big debate that ensued, one of the longest debates that ensued actually, was over the removal of officers. And this one was very interesting to me, what they got into. As you may be aware, the Constitution stipulates that the Senate must confirm all presidential appointees to major offices such as cabinet departments. So yeah, that's in the Constitution. It's ingrained. The Senate must confirm those appointments. But the Constitution is silent in regards to removal. It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution whether the president can remove officers and what the mechanism for that is. That was actually determined by the first Congress in 1789. After a lengthy debate, they did decide to give the president unilateral removal power, meaning the president can remove officers without Senate consent. But this was not a slam dunk decision. It was actually a tie vote, and it was broken by the vice presidential vote of John Adams. And essentially, they said, well, George Washington is the president. He is above all reproach. He's an honorable man. He would never abuse this power. And no one that serves as the president, in our estimation, would ever be someone who would abuse such power. And so Sprague, building off that idea, kind of jumps on that and says, but if those great and good men who now sleep with their fathers had survived to the present day, could they now make the same admission? Would they not declare that the shadows of their most gloomy predictions and darkest forebodings were closing around us in the process of actual realization? So what Sprague is doing here is something that we do all the time. What would the founders say? What would the founding fathers have thought about this? He's clearly not so far removed from it as we are, but he's going to that right there. He's saying, what would they think about this? Washington is not the president. If Andrew Jackson was president when they voted on removal, there is no chance they would have given Andrew Jackson unilateral removal power, someone like that. They never envisioned someone like Andrew Jackson being president. So he's basically saying we have to revisit this. Yes, they voted to allow the president to have removal power without Senate consent, but we need to revisit that now. because times have certainly changed. And it's very similar to today, right? The debates that we see today, Second Amendment, this and that, these are things that people argue have to be revisited. And it was no different back then. The Jacksonians took a different tack when it came to removal. They basically talked a lot about the faithful execution of the law. It says in the Constitution that the president has to ensure that the faithful execution of the law. And they argue, and Shepley, of course, it was first and foremost in this. He talks about how, in order to faithfully execute the law, that there must be a singular executive vision for government, and that the president is responsible for establishing that singular executive vision. So he kind of throws out the scenario here that, what would it look like if the president couldn't remove officers? Why, if the president were only to look on, were only an inactive spectator of what was going on, it might be the opinion of the collector of New York that the revenue laws were unconstitutional and therefore ought not to be executed. Why, a faithful execution of your laws becomes what? Why, a faithful execution becomes no execution at all, according to this interpretation. So basically what he's saying here is that the president cannot remove officers who do not accede to his will. The officers can do whatever they want, that they have no responsibility to anybody, because the president cannot remove them without Senate approval. And that's a whole big, another whole process. The president has to be able to consolidate the viewpoint that he has for the country around his officers, and be able to get rid of recalcitrant officers like William Duane, who will not accede to that will. So that is what the how the Maine senators looked at that particular issue. Before I wrap up here, which I'm going to do in a minute, I do want to just give you kind of where your Maine senators ended up after this. Neither of them were long for politics. After this debate ends, they both only stick around for a couple of years. Sprague, he was a Whig, and the state of Maine was going more towards the Jacksonian side, so he kind of loses favor in the state because of his Whig tendencies. He runs for governor and is defeated. He resigns from the Senate in 1835. He ends up going to Boston, where he starts a legal practice there, and eventually becomes a judge on the U.S. District Court in Massachusetts. Shepley also leaves office very shortly after, but not for the same reason. Despite his staunch defense of Jackson, Shepley's speech was actually very widely panned in the papers. Even the Jacksonian papers had a tough time defending him, mainly because of his style. He was seen as being very dull, being very laborious, being very lawyer-like, too sullen for politics. And he didn't enjoy it anyway. He did not enjoy being a senator. He preferred the quiet life of a judge to the turmoil of politics. So he actually resigned just 2 years into his first term. He goes back to Maine, and he becomes the Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Court eventually later in life. Both men lived very long lives. They both lived to the age of 87. Shepley dying first. He was a little older. They lived well beyond the Civil War, so they both like I said, lived very full lives. So that was their contribution to this whole thing, and they certainly contributed a lot. So what was the aftermath of all this? Well, the Whigs voted on, the Senate voted on March 28th, 1834, after 3 months of debate, to uphold Clay's resolutions. They voted 26-20 to censure Jackson for his actions in regards to the bank, but and pretty much claim him to be a king. But this victory is very short-lived. Jackson responds weeks later with a stirring protest message where he boldly asserts himself to be the direct representative of the American people. This is something that no other president has ever even thought to talk about, that they directly represent the American people, essentially saying that he is their defender against monstrous institutions like the bank. It also helped Jackson that by this point in time, Biddle's panic had failed. He created a lot of economic turmoil in the country, but Jackson and his handlers were able to flip the script and basically pass the blame onto Biddle. They didn't blame Jackson. They blamed Biddle instead and his bank. So the Whigs were on the defensive. They had a very tough time defending the bank because public sentiment was against it. Jackson, on the other hand, he emerges from this whole thing with more popularity than ever. The bank destroyed, the monster bank destroyed. His power expanded. He handed a defeat to his enemies in the Senate, and all he had to show for it on the downside was a legislative slap on the wrist. And even that didn't last. Thomas Hart Benton, his key defender in the Senate, after the censure was passed, made it his crusade to have the resolution expunged from the Senate record. And it takes only 3 years before he's able to accomplish this. When a pro-Jackson Senate majority takes over, they vote very quickly, really just before Jackson leaves office in January of 1837. You can kind of see it on the screen here down towards the bottom that the censure order is officially expunged. It says there that expunged by the order of the Senate on January 16th, 1837. So Jackson's, his censure officially doesn't even exist anymore because it has been officially expunged from the record. So, Jackson certainly wins that stage of the bank war. So what was the impact of the bank war? Well, the impacts were political. Even though it's a bank war, you think economics, the lasting impacts were political. First, the veto. We talked about the veto before that he used against the bank. Prior to this veto, presidents had really only vetoed bills for constitutional reasons. Jackson instead vetoed the bank. Now, don't get me wrong, he thought the bank was unconstitutional, but his real reason for vetoing the bank was because he didn't like it. He did not like the bank. So I'm not going to sign this law. Presidents hadn't done that before. They had signed any law that was constitutional. Jackson changes the veto as a tool to enforce constitutionality to a weapon to impose presidential will in lawmaking. And Congress today has to consider presidential will in making laws. It's not just, is it constitutional? It's, will the president actually sign this? And that's really in large part due to Jackson and his bank war veto. Jackson also tied electoral success to presidential action. He viewed his victory in the election of 1832 as a mandate to crush the bank. He was the anti-bank candidate. He wins the election. Therefore, I can do what I want in regards to the bank. This is something that presidents do today, right? They make campaign promises. They don't keep them all the time, or rarely, but they at least say, I'm going to do this. I got elected, so therefore I can now do this. It seems like something simple, but presidents before that didn't view their election that way. They just viewed it as kind of taking the torch from the last president and moving forward. And lastly, by establishing himself as the direct representative of the American people, Jackson transformed the president's role from kind of a detached onlooker to the champion of the people and the defender of the public interest. And that was something that the founders did not envision for the presidency at all. And Jackson certainly took it to that point. So the presidency that Jackson left office with in 1837 was unrecognizable, likely, to the founders who created it. And lastly here, I'll kind of leave you with this thought. Had the Whigs in the Senate been able to muster more than just this legislative slap on the wrist, could they, if they had actually defeated Jackson or had him impeached or whatever, would the men pictured here, who brought the presidency to much greater heights than it was with Jackson, would they have had the opportunity to? Or would Congress have reasserted itself as the lead dog in the government and made it more difficult for these men to take the presidency to the position where it is? So that about does it for me. Thank you all for listening. I'm going to unshare here and I'll turn it back over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Mike. That was really interesting. Folks, if you have questions for our speaker, you can go ahead and type those into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll start us off with the questions. So, Mike, what inspired you or brought you to write this book about this particular topic? You're on mute, Mike.
I've only been not teaching for a week and I'm already on mute.
That's okay.
So it actually kind of fell into my lap. It revolved around the Trump impeachment, actually. The first time around when Trump was acquitted. And the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who's been in the news recently, he brought up, because the impeachment failed, that he might have a resolution to censure Trump for his actions. And I knew from my teaching experience and from reading and whatnot that a president had been censured once, and it was Andrew Jackson. And I knew that it had to do with the bank, but that was it. I really had no other idea of why. So kind of to prepare for possibly seeing what was going to happen with Trump being impeached, I just wanted to see how the Senate went about doing that with Jackson. And when I got into it, I saw there's a lot here. And really the big thing is that the bank war is covered in a lot of literature. There's books about the bank war. There are surveys of the era, of the Jackson era, that cover the bank war. It's a very important topic. But the debates that took place in the Senate that I just went over usually get a paragraph, maybe a page at most. And it really just goes, Henry Clay made the resolutions, and then they voted on it. And all of the discussion that took place over those 3 months is kind of omitted. And if you're doing a survey of 40 years of history. Of course, you can't get into that. But so I just felt that this was a story that needed to be told, and just kind of add to what was already there. I'm not trying to make any sort of grand revelatory argument to alter the meaning of the bank war, but just to kind of add something that I felt was lacking in the story.
I know one of our listeners pointed out that there are some interesting parallels between this story and what's been happening in the United States just in the past couple of years. You mentioned some of them. Do you see any other parallels between what was happening in like 1820-ish, what's happening in 2020-ish, and whether it's in terms of presidential power or our financial institutions? I know that we often say, history repeats itself, or at the very least, historians repeat each other. But is there anything else I guess just in terms of parallels that we might take away?
Well, I think one of the things that I see a lot today that was certainly prevalent in the 1820s and 30s is this fear of like an aristocracy emerging. So we have these, it's the billionaire class now. Obviously, there weren't billionaires back then, but it's the billionaire class, the Bezoses of the world, and the Elon Musk and all those people that they just wield too much power. They have too much power over the country, and it's very similar to what Jackson and his supporters feared about the bank, that it would create a class of people that would just wield power. And one of the things I didn't get into, just because of time, of course, was one of the main reasons why Jackson and Taney wanted the deposits removed is because they accused the bank of electioneering, of basically throwing its money at Henry Clay and doing everything it could to get Jackson defeated. And we see this all the time, right? That corporations, the big money in politics, right? Influencing politics, throwing money at candidates. It existed at this time on a much smaller scale, of course, but it's the same idea is who should really be the ones making the decisions for the country moving forward? Should it be the rank and file people, or should it be the people who are most connected? It really depends on who you ask, I guess, but there's certainly parallels there.
Yeah, a lot of those things that we've been debating or arguing about, the players have changed, and some of the particulars have changed, but those big questions, in a lot of ways, that hasn't changed very much at all.
Certainly.
Can you tell us a little bit about, so we know what inspired you to do this book? How did you go about researching it?
Well, I mean, I did a lot of the research during the pandemic. So luckily, all of the debates, all those quotes that I put up on the screen, everything, those are all readily accessible in the Library of Congress. It's called the Register of Debates, and it has all the Senate debates going back to 1789, all the way up through, I'm not sure exactly where it stops, but all those early debates, you can go through, you can literally read every single thing that every single person said. It was a lot. I mean, it was a lot of reading. It was, almost 1,000 pages worth of debate that for this particular one. I said it went on very long. And that's where I got a lot of the research. I did a lot of the secondary research through, there's, like I said, many books out there. There's a lot of great newspaper, historical newspaper sites. I got my master's degree from the University of Arizona State, so I still have access to all those resources there. So, I mean, I wasn't going to be able to go crawling around into the archives because you weren't allowed to. So thankfully, this topic was focused enough, narrow enough in its scope where all the information I needed was kind of in one spot. So that made it very easy for me. But what inspired me? I mean, I've always felt that I was a pretty good writer, and it was never like I'm going to write a book someday, but I was always in the back of my mind. And something that if something ever inspired me or something ever came on my lap that I think I could actually do something with, I figured I'd go for it. And when I started researching, I wrote a page here, and I'm like, wow, I thought maybe this would be like an article or something. And I was like, wow, 100 pages, and I'm still going. I haven't even gotten through half of it yet. I was like, all right, I might as well just go for it and see what I can do. And then, it all kind of worked out for me. So I was, very, very happy that it all worked out.
So what do your students think that their teacher is a published author and historian now. Are they impressed, or are they?
I teach seventh graders, so they can care less. But I mean, I got a few people that, you know, a few of my kids are like, wow, that's really cool, Mr. Grant, that's awesome. Or what's your book about? And like, it's funny because this book, I teach American history, and one of the topics I do teach about the Bank War now. You know, it's seventh grade, so we can't get too much into the weeds there. So, and it's funny, the book came out, the book was published right around the same time I was actually covering that this year with the students, but I wasn't going to like, hey guys, here's my book. It's not really my style, but yeah, I actually coach high school players. I got more response from them. They're a little older, so they were like, "Oh, I heard about your book. That's awesome." And what was it about? So that was cool. And I guess with my players, because I'm a baseball person, and I want them to kind of take away the idea that, like, you be well balanced. Like, sporty guy, I like sports, I coach, but I also have this, you know, the academic part of it, and the scholarly part of it, and I read a lot. So you know, it doesn't have to be one or other. You can definitely have a little bit of both, and there's room for both.
For sure. I think that's a great message for students, for all of us. And we always love to see too, you know, at MHS, the folks that are like kind of these sort of grassroots like projects, just, you know, sort of this idea came up and it was something you were interested in, and you did the legwork and the homework and did your research, and you know, here it is.
Yeah.
I love that you mentioned how, you know, I mean, the pandemic in a sense kind of gave you this opportunity, and how so much of it, almost all of it, the research you're doing online. And that's something that folks can tap into Maine Historical Society for. If you visit our online database, Maine Memory Network, mainememory.net, you can do a lot of historical research about Maine and greater New England from your own home. And Maine Historical Society, our research library, is also open by appointment Wednesday through Saturday. If you visit our website, mainehistory.org, you can learn more about how you can come in to visit us in person and do research. Both of the senators that you mentioned, Sprague and Shepley, were themselves MHS members, and I understand we have things in our collection that speak to the work that both of them did. Shepley was the father of George Shepley, who was a military governor of Louisiana during the Civil War, and that family was very influential in local politics. We have a lot of their papers at MHS. So folks, if you haven't had the opportunity to do some digging into, you know, a historical question you may have, to follow Mike's example, make an appointment with MHS, or visit us online at Maine Memory Network. Mike, thank you so much. This was a really interesting presentation, really interesting topic. I know I was really grateful for the opportunity to learn more about those Maine senators. It was eye-opening for me in that respect. Is there anything else, I'll give you the last word, you'd like to share or say before we close out the program?
No, I just want to thank you. I mean, you were great through this whole process, and for giving me a chance to come and talk to your people here. And I enjoyed it. I loved it. And you know, hope if you were interested in what I said today, you know, go out and get the book, and you can learn more. I get really much into that second resolution also about the banking part of it. I'm not a banking expert for sure, but I learned enough to be able to explain it, I think, hopefully pretty well. And you know, it really was a lot of fun. It was the first book talk I've had for the book. It came out a couple months ago, so it was great. I do want to ask one thing. Did I get the pronunciation of Saco correct? Did I say that correctly? The town?
Saco. Saco. Yep. Yeah. Very, very close. Yeah.
I hear saying at Seiko,
closer than
it's
a
like
lot of other
sacrilegious
people
in Maine.
has come. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm from New Jersey, so it's a little different. So,
if you ever find yourself in Maine, it's a great town to visit.
It looked very. I was looking for pictures of it. It looked beautiful.
Yeah,
but thank you again, Kathleen. Thank you to everyone who was listening.
It was our pleasure, Mike. And folks, you can purchase your copy of the book, Panic in the Senate, for Maine Historical Society. Visit the store online at mainehistorystore.com, or visit us at our Congress Street location in Portland, 489 Congress Street. We are open Wednesday through Saturday. Visit mainehistory.org to learn more about our hours and how you can visit. And thanks everyone again for being with us this evening. Hope we'll see you back soon.
Thank you.